First impressions mean a lot, though second impressions can change everything. I know I said becoming female's terribleness was hilarious, and while I was laughing at points during the Let's Read, I found myself groaning a lot more this time around. Probably because the joke got old and becoming female's nature as a bad fanfiction became more obvious because of it. Speaking of things wrong with becoming female, number one, the premise. Despite being as God's choice of title, this is not a story about how Harry Potter adjusts to a new life after accidentally being gender swapped. The fact that Crystal used to be Harry is pretty irrelevant to the proceedings of the story. Now, would someone undergo some kind of change after switching genders? Yes, but not such a drastic shift like this. By only the second chapter, she's acting like she was always a girl. The sequel is called Being Female, and that sounds like a more accurate title, but we'll get to that. Still, I feel like Harry being turned into Crystal was not to tell the story that you would expect from the title. It was to be used as a shield. Allow me to explain. Number two, the Mary Sue reputation. Some authors aren't smart enough to notice when they are writing Mary Sue characters, which is why they even exist in the first place. They write this perfect little angel that every character in the story loves and is good at everything, and steals roles intended for canonical characters. I have two theories as to why Harry was turned into a girl, and the Mary Sue's reputation is one of them. See, more traditional Mary Sues are stand-ins for the author so they can do awesome things and overshadow their favorite characters. Contradiction of motives, I know. Or so they can imagine themselves in romantic relationships with characters they love. We can all see Venus God imagining herself in Crystal's place in the relationship with Malfoy, after all. Her profile page even describes a dream she had where she was making out with the guy before being interrupted by a murder attempt by Ron. But because Crystal is Harry after a gender swap, Venus God must have assumed that meant she was safe from having her original character be called a Mary Sue. It's why she took criticism of Crystal so personally. Well, she was wrong. In a big way. We've seen authors can turn their favorite characters into Mary Sues even if they weren't one in the source material. It's not just the ones they make up themselves. If you're curious as to what my second theory was as to why a gender swap was involved, well... Number three, social justice issues. The most obvious issue brought up in the story is sexism, but before I talk about that, I want to give my second theory as to why Crystal exists. You may remember in the first chapter, Harry says, and I quote, Draco was the hottest guy in school and all the girls wanted him, but I was a boy and not gay, so we couldn't be together. Now I know what you're thinking. Venus God can't be homophobic. She's clearly a yaoi fangirl who ships Harry and Malfoy. Well, that's just it. She changed it so it wouldn't be a gay relationship. Plus the flamboyant behavior from Dumbledore, the de-gayification camp subplot, makes me think she sees it as a joke, and if there was a gender swap, it could be taken more seriously. Now my theory regarding Mary Sue's is probably the more accurate one, but I just thought I'd mention it. Especially when the story throws around the sexism card much more often. At the risk of starting a flame war in the comments section, I'm just going to say this. Nobody goes around proudly proclaiming that they are sexist to enjoy raping and abusing women. They tend to be a little more subtle than Ron is here in the story. And the whole sluts like being around rapists angle? If there's anyone who values consent, it would be someone who likes to sleep around. It's kind of part of the motivation. Though I don't know why I'm even talking about this quote-unquote theme of the story. It may be shoved down our throats at every opportunity, but it means exactly nothing to the narrative. Replace sexists and sluts with almost any other evil force and there's barely a change. Replace Ron and the Death Eaters that are serving him instead of Voldemort for no good reason with anyone else and nothing is different. In fact, number four, the characters. No matter how many characters whose voices and manners I may imitate, they will not be the characters we know and love from the Harry Potter books and movies. The real question becomes who's the most out of character out of all of them? Crystal, Malfoy, or Ron? Ron's position as a villain is 100% in opposition as Harry's best friend, with no basis whatsoever for his supposed sexist attitude in the source material. Because of Crystal's nature as a self-insert, there's nothing in common she has with Harry. I don't remember Harry being this selfish and shallow. But you know a character I have seen be defined by their selfishness? Malfoy. He's a bully, he's selfish, vain, self-important, a pure-blood supremacist, and here he is in this story described as a noble gentleman. I could go on with Dumbledore's flamboyancy, Hermione and Luna being yes men, and the Death Eaters deciding to change their objective from taking over the wizarding world and subjecting those who aren't pure-blooded wizards to suddenly working for Ron instead of Voldemort and do random sexist things in a cartoonish fashion. But I already know the answer as to why so many changes were made. Number 5. Favoritism. Two very hated, but at the same time common tropes seen in Harry Potter fanfiction are on display here in Becoming Female. Having one in the story does not mean the other is also present, but this is a strong example where both are present, and they're motivated by favoritism. Part A. Ron the Death Eater. Whether an author thinks Hermione should have hooked up with Harry instead of Ron, or they saw the movies without reading the books, the same movies that tried to make him look bad in order to make others look good, or they just think he's boring, there are fans who do not like Ron, so they like to turn him into a villain. Of course, when authors do this, they have nothing to go on based on Ron's characterization, except for maybe jealousy of Harry, but that doesn't factor into Becoming Female, so they have to make up shit like, oh, I don't know, joining the Death Eaters because Harry was turned into a woman. Seriously, it's one of the first things we are told about him in the story, setting the stage for this thing that called itself Ron, but isn't even close to the character Joanne Rowling wrote. Part B. Draco in leather pants. Now, if you want the opposite of Part A, look to the idea of taking a character the author loves, but that character is an antagonist, if not outright villain, and make them a romantic interest for one of the protagonists. Malfoy is the former, and it is true he didn't have the stones to turn into a straight-up villain. He was all talking, no game. But at the same time,
I'm totally rich, and I'm really proud that I'm pure-blooded wizard. Hee 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 hee. Ha 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 ha. What a wonderful person.
And yet, Malfoy is adored by our young Venus god and many other young girls. And unlike with Ron and his villainization, there is a very, very clear reason why. Tom Felton has grown into an attractive young man. It makes it easier for someone to turn him to the side of good, even though, like with Ron and his demonizing, he becomes unrecognizable as the character from the books. I'm just going to quote Rowling herself considering her own thoughts on this issue, because it's very telling about the dissonance between what's written on the page and what ran through Venus God's mind. It amuses me. It honestly amuses me. People have been waxing lyrical in letters about Draco Malfoy, and I think that's the only time when it stopped amusing me and started almost worrying me. I'm trying to clearly distinguish between Tom Felton, who is a good-looking young boy, and Draco, who, whatever he looks like, is not a nice man. It's a romantic but unhealthy and unfortunately all too common delusion of girls, and you will know this, that they are going to change someone, and that persists through many women's lives till their deathbed, and it is uncomfortable and unhealthy, and it actually worries me a little bit to see young girls swearing undying devotion to this really imperfect character because there must be an element in there that I'll be the one who changes him. Meanwhile, I understand the psychology of it, but it's pretty unhealthy. So a couple times I have written back, possibly quite sharply, saying, you want to rethink your priorities there. But hey, why am I even bothering with quoting Rowling when, according to Venus God's profile page, she doesn't even know who Rowling is? Number 6. The structure. I don't know what I can say that isn't self-evident about this subject. Looking at the list of chapters, it deceives readers into thinking it's longer than it actually is. It's a collection of scenes trying to pass themselves off as individual chapters. I'd compare it to the kind of writing you expect from a child in the single-digit age range. I don't know Venus God's age when she wrote this, nor how old she is now, but her statement about the subject of her age in the author's note for chapter 35 still seems like she was making excuses for herself. But perhaps more to the point, this thing is padded like hell. So many scenes that contribute exactly nothing to the story or the characters, quite opposite in the latter's case. Some of it is ill-conceived on Venus God's part, especially how we're supposed to take the romance and the conflict with Ron and the Death Eaters seriously. This is by her own admission, as well as how she took so much offense to what readers said, to the point she'd twist their words and put them in the story itself, talk of lobotomies being the most common. But not everything is motivated by this. Some of it is by our next topic. Number 7. Humor. My Immortal is a particularly infamous Harry Potter fanfiction, which is this one takes a lot of cues from. The former story has a lot of needless descriptions of what characters are wearing, which is why Becoming Female has the same, though it's made intentionally silly with bright mismatching colors. And at the start it was funny, but it got old after a second read. You could argue Crystal's vanity is also meant to be a joke, but it comes across more like an insult towards the character Harry was, as I've already tried to elaborate on. There are a couple references to other parody series, Potter Puppet Pals, with things Draco likes being among his wedding gifts, and Dumbledore's consistent nudity. But that was portrayed by puppets, whereas here in a fanfiction, we are forced to imagine how the characters actually look in the series. We imagine a very old man spending the latter half of the series naked, making our eyes burn. Whether or not the pirate wedding was also supposed to be humorous, or perhaps saying characters who look like people who didn't actually play them in films is a joke too, is hard to say. The author's notes and Venus God's strong attachment to Crystal seems too genuine. Now, this would be the part where I talk about how to fix the story, leaving us with two possibilities. A spoof of My Immortals showing how the actual characters from the books would react to a Mary Sue following them around and being a nuisance, which already exists, link in the description. The other is a story about a gender swap, but it wouldn't have much unique to the Harry Potter series itself. And that's because... Number 8. What does this shit have to do with Harry Potter? Very little of this story has anything to do with Harry Potter. It's like Rowling said, fans like Venus God have a thing for actor Tom Felton, not Malfoy. She certainly doesn't care for Lockhart or Crumb since she thinks they're played by Robert Pattinson. Come to think about it, Venus God is clearly more of a Twilight fan than a Harry Potter fan, with it being repeatedly mentioned. Events from the Harry Potter series are mentioned, but it's not too different from what Aizuki did in Super Sentai vs. Power Rangers. It's a face-palming attempt to prove the author knows something about the series. Just because events and locations are mentioned, it means nothing because they are quickly disregarded. If we are to believe this takes place after Voldemort's take over the school, aka the finale of Deathly Hallows, then Sirius, Dumbledore, Mad-Eye Moody, Wormtail, Colin, Fred, Tonks, Lestrange, Snape, and Voldemort should all be dead. And yet all of them either appear or are at least mentioned. And the survivors should have completed their character development. The wizarding world should be in a state of recovery after the most devastating event in wizarding history. But sexism, sluts, straw feminism, and stupid clothing choices take precedent. This is a story that takes place in the Harry Potter setting, with characters we all know and love, but that doesn't matter. I could go back and make up new names for the characters and setting, and it wouldn't make a lick of difference. Number 9. The sequel. Venus God asked her readers for a sequel, and while I doubt anyone wanted one, a sequel was made. Must have been deleted at some point, though, because what I found was a repost by someone else. And its second verse, same as the first. I think the chapters in the sequel are even shorter this time around. I'm just going to go over the highlights because I really don't want to have to go through this again. First, the fact Crystal was pregnant is not forgotten. She gives birth in the first chapter during a scene that makes the birthing scene in My Inner Life look like the more realistic depiction by comparison. I wouldn't get used to the newborn, however, it's forgotten about very quickly. Second point, Umbridge comes back to life, kills Fudge, and takes over the Ministry, leading to Crystal, Malfoy, and Luna needing to take refuge at the Dursleys. Yes, it was a plot point that Crystal couldn't return to them in the original story. Glad you remembered. Venus God didn't. Point 3. Vernon Dursley is described as a Christian fundamentalist, constantly saying, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." Because Harry Potter doesn't already have a difficult relationship with religion in the real world, much less in fanfiction. Petunia is a slut who dies during an orgy with 6 random men, and Luna and Dudley hook up for no reason. Also, Joke Girl, one of the readers from the last story, is brought up a lot more often in the author's notes, as well as on a TV show Dudley watches, where she is portrayed as a dumb blonde who gets a forced lobotomy, surprising no one. Highlight number 4. Ron Raper comes back to life, also not as surprising, although it's at least 2/3 of the way in before he does show up. And it happens with no explanation. At least Umbridge's return was explained. It was a hologram of her that got killed in the original story. Because that makes sense. And most facepalming of all is our final highlight. Venus God realizes Crumb was not played by Robert Pattinson either. You'd think, well, third time's the charm, right? Well, you'd be wrong. Go ahead. Guess who she presumes is played by Patterson this time? Doesn't matter what your answer is, though, because you could not possibly have guessed this. This time, it's Barty Crouch Jr.
What?
Just in case you were wondering what my initial reaction when reading it was. Becoming female was a unique experience that I probably won't be replicating with another fanfiction anytime soon. But if you are eager for more, then I'll leave a link to Venus God's being female. I don't think it's anywhere near as amusing, even on a first read, but you might have a different opinion. In the meantime, I have an assignment for you all.
Turn to page 394.